Thank you. Let me first begin by defining a crisis and why it is important and significant during periods of, I would say, increased political competition, such as during election periods. So, I mean, if we look at a crisis is a multifaceted creature. It has three different parts to it going at the same time. So to call a crisis, it needs to have these three elements. A threat to values. This can be all kinds of values, tangible or intangible. It can be human life, it can be ideology, it can be identity, it can be economic nature, different things. The second point, that there is an element of uncertainty. So it's not exactly known what is going to happen next and when it is going to happen. So you've got this element of uncertainty which can elevate the sense or perception of risk and hazard. The third one is the issue of time constraint. So the longer a crisis goes on, the more damage is done to society, the more difficult it is to recover from that crisis. So if that's looking at these physical aspects, there are also different informational and cognitive aspects to a crisis too. So, for example, when a crisis occurs, I mean, often there is a political call for action, a mobilization, which makes use of information as a means to project that person or that party to be able to be the one to solve the crisis. The point is that does not need to be true, but it needs to be credible enough to be believed. And this comes to my next point, that when you have a crisis, the crisis is at the center, but around the crisis, you have these different information flows. And the information flows can come from different sources, mass media being one of those sources. So if we look at those different information flows around a crisis, this is what helps an audience understand and relate to the crisis and how it affects them, and perhaps how to get out of that crisis. Now, the party that controls, or the actor that controls those information flows, is the one that, in fact, has a greater degree to control or to project a certain reality. So they have more freedom of maneuver because they are projecting what a constructed reality is. And the actor or the party that is not in control of those information flows is controlled by them. So that restricts their ability to be effective in what they're doing in terms of what policies, what actions, etc., can or cannot be taken. It reduces their choices and tends to corral them into a certain posture. Now, if we're looking at what are those things which are effective in terms of this informational sphere or informational realm, this is not long and complex arguments and presentation of facts and so forth, but rather what motivates an audience are catchphrases and slogans. And this is seen around the world. An audience has their imagination captured. And the point is, catchphrases and slogans, because there's two different ways of achieving a logic. One is a reasoned logic, and a reasoned logic is based on an individual that is rationally thinking about the information, processing it, and making certain conclusions. And this is a hard audience to win because they are critical thinkers and not so easy to convince. However, the other option is an emotional logic, and this emotional logic is something completely different. It's, first of all, if the audience is, it's mobilized, and in this case, they cease to be an individual, a critical thinker, but rather become and develop what is called a herd mentality. So in this case, they react to certain stimuli subconsciously, and so therefore are rather easily manipulated by the speaker. And we can see that in different historical contexts. And for example, if we look at the speeches of Adolf Hitler, when he got the crowd into an emotional frenzy, they could be controlled without them knowing it and not thinking critically individually, but emotionally as a herd. And this becomes problematic within these contexts here. So if we're looking at the role, I mean, it's already been mentioned, political marketing. However, political marketing is one of those things which is becoming much more, invasive around the world. It might have some very specific individual context, but the general idea of it is understood. And this is not only the professionalization of communicating campaigns, which is done with very specialized media consultants and very, I would say, trained politicians. Because if we look at the different so-called leaders of liberal democracy, they seem to be cut very similarly in terms of the cognitive profile. Trudeau, Macron, and these other ones, they're very similar in terms of how they present themselves, how they present their ideas, and their particular political agenda. There is also the aspect of a permanent campaign. So political campaigns do not stop as soon as an election is over. But however, they keep on going, maybe less intensely, but continual all the same. And we could see this in the United States recently, especially in the wake of, first of all, the attempt to get rid of Donald Trump. And now if we look at the attempt to ensure that Donald Trump does not come back. And this is, if we look at how this operates within the so-called liberal democracies of the world, there are a number of similarities. For example, if we look in the United States, the mainstream mass media tend to be liberal and ideological and support the political establishment. So therefore the status quo. And those media which tend to be social media or very, shall we say, non-mainstream media like Breitbart and these other different media outlets, they are also ideological, but from another perspective. They are supporting the anti-political establishment. So you've got these two forces continually opposing each other, and the campaign which they run is not necessarily a political campaign about reasons to elect them, but reasons not to elect the competition. So if we look at what happened in the United States in 2020, there are also outside factors which come into it, which provides a good lesson for politics elsewhere. That another crisis can strike and affect the viability of a political candidate, which is not necessarily something within their control. And I'm talking about the coronavirus. And this is being used as a means to bring Joe Biden in. And if we look at the previous election in 2016 in the US, the candidate was not about, the result of the election was not really about who was the best candidate, but who was not the worst candidate. So you have a choice between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And Donald Trump was able to much more connect with the audience because he knew what a large portion of the audience wanted, what they were thinking, what resonated with them. So in this regard, he was much better than Hillary Clinton, who assumed that she was going to win and did not. And so now we have Joe Biden, who is, I think, somehow even worse than Trump, because at least Trump is cognitively present, which I don't think Joe Biden is. So a lot of this is about facade and this contextual competition between not degrees of quality, but degrees of the least worst option, or the perceived least worst option. I mean, we've had the election in Sweden in September. It was on the 11th, so not that long ago. And this was somehow considered a surprise for the Swedish Social Democrat Party and its alliance. It should not have been. The Social Democrats somehow still were the single biggest party, but the Swedish Democrats were the second biggest party. And the Swedish Democrats represent anti-political establishment, as Trump branded himself anti-political establishment in the American system. So people were sick of liberalism, and a lot of this was based on things like various existing crises within Sweden. And one of these is an economic crisis, and another one is an identity crisis, and also a social crisis. And so you have economic problems, political problems, and a various number of things. And this is in part reflected by the trajectory of the former leftist coalition, which abandoned the idea of Swedish exceptionalism and this model of Swedish socialism, and instead have adopted more ideological approach of global liberalism with multiculturalism and globalization, both of which have been causing massive crises, economic as well as the so-called migrant crisis. Now,
Dr. Greg, you have about 4 minutes to round up, please.
Yep, sure. And if we look at the Swedish Democrats, they were posed as being a neo-Nazi, this right-wing populist party. However, if we look at it, they are not neo-Nazi. The origins may well have been, but if we look at 1940, it was the Social Democrats as government which invited Adolf Hitler to speak in Stockholm. So you got these different historical contexts. Now, so the Swedish Democrats have flipped things around. So rather than adopt it, they are socially conservative, but have adopted this idea of bringing back this Swedish exceptionalism, the Swedish socialism. And this did resonate with people, not only white Swedes, but also immigrants as well. Those certain segments of immigrants, young people. In 2019, 2018, they had 11% of 18 to 21-year-olds voted for the Swedish Democrats. It was 22 this time. So there are lessons to be learned from that. And if we look at the Nigerian context, the history, I mean, if we look 1983 to 1989, when there was a military junta ruling, there was this period without elections. But since 1999, there have been 6 general elections. And so this is a step in the right direction, certainly, but also one needs to be wary because there are fractures in society. I mean, you have religious, ethnic, there are economic problems, there's access to representation issues within Nigeria, and these can be exploited in a negative campaign, and they probably will. And so it's a matter of being aware how these particular campaigns are initiated and how they are run. And this is in terms of catchphrases and slogans, especially, which are trying to bring about this herd mentality in the voting public in order to capture hearts and minds, which translates to votes. So, I mean, I will end by saying that the so-called liberal democracy is now, it's gone the wrong way in terms of how it conceives itself and how it perpetuates, because liberal democracy now is all about liberalism or neoliberalism, utterly at the expense of democracy. And we can see this in the UK. I mean, you have a new Prime Minister. No one voted for Liz Truss. I mean, you wouldn't want to inflict Liz Truss on your worst enemy. I mean, she is she is probably the worst candidate you could choose. And this is the direction of so-called Western democracies and where they are heading. And this should be a warning and a lesson for those countries of the global south, what not to do.